Mr. President, I rise today to call this body's attention to a crisis that grows more alarming every day, and that's the continued Russian encroachment into Ukraine. It's been nearly 2 months since the Ukrainian government entered into a ceasefire with Russian-backed insurgents in southeastern Ukraine. It's an agreement that the separatists have repeatedly violated, and since it came into effect, hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers have died in battles against these same separatist forces. The Ukrainian people want peace, but these insurgents and their patrons in Washington and Moscow are not interested. And every day, they grow more aggressive and bolder in their violations of Ukrainian territory and their willingness to subvert the international order. I know there's some in this body who would say, this is not our problem. It's thousands of miles away, not really our concern. Ultimately, to some people, they may think it doesn't matter which flag flies over this piece of territory. I have a different view. To me, what happens in Ukraine is very much in our interests. It's in the interests of all who value liberty and the right to choose one's own future. The stakes are very high, and the consequences of inaction are devastating. To those who ask, why is this important? Let me bring up several points. First, it's in America's traditional interest, and it's our traditional commitment to support democracy around the world and to uphold the right of a people to choose their own destiny. When the Soviet Union fell and the people of Eastern Europe took back the liberty that had been stolen from them decades before, the United States made a solemn promise. Embrace democracy, freedom, transparency, the rule of law, and we will embrace you. The Ukrainian people made their choice. They did so on the 24th of August, 1991, when an independent Ukraine ceased to be a dream and became a reality. They reaffirmed that commitment over a decade later when the Orange Revolution swept a corrupt government from office. And this year, earlier this year, in the face of Russian threats, intimidation, and aggression, they did so again. I saw that commitment firsthand earlier this year when I joined, along with my colleague from Maryland, Mr. Cardin, a congressional delegation to monitor the Ukrainian presidential elections. There, Senator Cardin and I saw the spirit of the Ukrainian people and their determination to honor the memory of brave men and women who had given their lives in the fight for a free and independent Ukraine. That fight continues today. But this fight is about more than just Ukraine. And failing to honor our commitment to the Ukrainians will have real consequences that extend to other national security priorities for the United States of America. When Ukraine emerged as an independent nation after the Cold War, it inherited the world's third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. As a newly independent state looking to ensure its sovereignty and territorial integrity, Ukraine could have relied on its nuclear arsenal to ward off would-be aggressors. They made a different decision. Instead of pursuing this dangerous path, Ukraine sought and received assurances from the international community that its borders would be respected if it gave up its nuclear weapons. In fact, in 1994, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia signed the Budapest Memorandum, in which all sides pledged to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, refrain from using military force or economic pressure to limit Ukrainian sovereignty, and provide assistance to Ukraine if it becomes the victim of aggression from another nation. Clearly, Russia has broken its part of that agreement. Now the question is whether we are breaking ours. If we do break our word, what will the impact be on American counter-proliferation efforts around the world? How can any nation we seek to prevent from developing nuclear weapons ever trust the U.S. security assurances if they see the carnage and destruction in Ukraine? If they see this as being the result of trading nuclear weapons for American guarantees? More than just the credibility of U.S. counter-proliferation efforts is at stake here. Events in Ukraine are a direct challenge to the entire U.S.-led international order. U.S. economic and military power was the glue that kept the Western alliance together through the challenges of the Cold War and formed the foundation of an international order based on universal values and standards of conduct that has led to unprecedented global prosperity and stability. This, in turn, has produced a period of U.S. economic growth and security unrivaled in our nation's history. Confidence in America's willingness to use our unmatched capabilities to uphold this system deters potential challengers and incentivizes other countries to play by the rules, which prevents us from actually having to use them. America's commitment to uphold this system is incredibly important. If the credibility of this commitment is in doubt, then the stability and openness upon which U.S. economic prosperity and national security depend is jeopardized, and the chance for violence, instability, and economic collapse increases. By the way, the Russian government knows all this. President Putin, who famously declared the collapse of the Soviet Union to be the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, knows that his dream of building a new Russian empire out of the ashes of the Soviet Union requires establishing Russian dominance over its newly independent neighbors, many of whom want closer integration with the West, including Ukraine. Closer integration with the West, not Russia. To accomplish this goal, Moscow must shatter this political, economic, military, and ideological credibility of the Western system. Russian aggression against Ukraine today or Georgia back in 2008 is as much about demonstrating the emptiness of U.S. and Western guarantees as it is about control of these individual countries, in my view. The conflict in Ukraine is the latest escalation of this trend, one that will continue until the United States and its allies say firmly, this shall not continue. The President keeps saying that, quote, there is no military solution to this conflict. The President may think so, but Moscow certainly does not. The direct Russian military involvement in Ukraine has been on full display for the world to see for months. In previous times, it may have been easier to keep these movements out of sight, even as President Putin does his best to suppress a free press. But we're fortunate to have brave reporters willing to document what they see for all the world to witness. Here are a few examples in the media from recent days. This is a picture of a Russian-made T-90 main battle tank in the Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine recently. That's a province of Ukraine. This T-90 tank, by the way, is the most sophisticated Russian tank. Mr. President, you know who owns these T-90 tanks? Here are the countries: Algeria, Azerbaijan, India, Turkmenistan, and Russia. I think it's safe to say that these tanks didn't drive from South Asia or from North Africa. They came from Russia, in Ukraine. Here's a picture of a Sukhoi 24 attack fighter, reportedly taken in Russia. You'll see painted on the tail the universal flag for Ukrainian separatists. Not many people are aware of reports that Russia is helping to create a separatist air force, but we must wake up and realize the extent to which Russia is determined to trample on Ukraine and the global order to achieve its ends. In the last couple of days, we've also seen reports of significant movement of Russian aircraft to airfields closer to the Ukrainian border. These are just a few examples of the Russian armored personnel carriers, artillery, tanks, air defense systems, electronic warfare units, and thousands of Russian troops that NATO reports say have moved into Ukraine over the last several weeks. According to Ukrainian analysts, Russian and separatist forces have been organized into mobile strike groups and have completed reconnaissance of Ukrainian positions in preparation of an all-out assault. Barely a day has gone by since the signing of the so-called ceasefire in September, where Ukrainian troops haven't come under attack, as separatists probe Ukrainian defenses looking for an opening. Since the beginning of the conflict, conservative estimates have put the number of Ukrainian soldiers killed at roughly 4,000. And by the way, another 5,000 civilians killed or wounded in the fighting. We shouldn't be afraid to call this exactly what it is. This is part of a Russian invasion. We saw it with Crimea. We're now seeing it in other parts of the border with Ukraine. 2 months ago, the president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, spoke here before a joint session of Congress. We were all there. It was a poignant speech, a powerful speech, and one from the heart. There's a line from that speech that I think stood out. In speaking about the humanitarian aid we have sent to Ukraine and thanking us for that aid, but asking us for additional aid for their military, President Poroshenko said, and I quote, "One cannot win the war with blankets. Even more so, we cannot keep the peace with a blanket." And he was right. Blankets won't stop this tank that we saw earlier. Blankets won't stop bullets. Blankets won't protect Ukrainian children from Russian artillery shells. We don't know a whole lot about what the U.S. has provided to the Ukrainians. I'll get to that in a moment. We're having trouble getting that from the administration. But we do know a few things. We know we've given them blankets, sleeping mats, military rations, military kits, medical kits, and body armor. This is what we have been providing, as far as we know, to the Ukrainian military. I know the Ukrainians are grateful for these items, but when you compare this to the Russian involvement, the differences are stark. Here's what we provided for the Ukrainians. Here's the Russian support being provided to the separatists. I'm proud of the hard-working Ohioans. Well, I'm proud of the hard-working Ohioans in Cincinnati and elsewhere who are making these rations in Ohio. The folks in Heath who produce these helmets, they know as well as I do that this equipment won't constitute deterrence, especially not when the Ukrainians are facing advanced Russian equipment and troops. Mr. President, may I ask unanimous consent for an additional 3 minutes?
Without objection.
Thank you. I don't mean to downplay the importance of the economic, political, and humanitarian aid we provided. Indeed, there are many economic and political reforms the Ukrainians will need to make in order to secure long-term peace and prosperity. But how can Ukraine be expected to make these difficult but necessary reforms if it can't even control its own borders or maintain law and order? There's a military dimension to this crisis we simply cannot ignore any further. Moscow continues to believe that military force is a viable option to achieve its goals. And unless the United States and its allies help the Ukrainians prove otherwise, we shouldn't expect any change in behavior. Ukraine needs anti-tank weapons to defend against armored assaults. It needs modern air defense systems to defend against Russian air superiority. It needs unmanned aircraft to monitor its borders and detect violations of its sovereignty and the ceasefire. It needs secure communications gear to prevent Russia from accessing Ukrainian plans and troop locations. It needs advanced counter-battery radar to target the artillery batteries responsible for so many of the casualties in the conflict. It needs elite rapid reaction forces capable of responding to Russian border provocations and fast-moving, asymmetrical, hybrid war tactics Russia has used to destabilize the country. Therefore, they need training. Ukraine has asked for this support, and we should provide it. Most importantly, Ukraine needs a sustained commitment from the United States and our NATO allies to provide both the quality and the quantity of equipment necessary to preserve its independence. This is not a partisan issue, Mr. President. Leading Democrats in the Senate, such as Chairman of the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee, Senators Levin and Menendez, as well as Senator Cardin and others, have called for increased assistance, including defensive weapons. Yet the President and some of his top advisors continue to stand in the way of meaningful action for fear of provoking Russia, as if the tanks streaming into Ukraine or the daily clashes aren't evidence enough that the American restraint has not had the desired effect on Russian activity and policy. It's well known by now that the President has refused to adopt policies that actually provide Ukraine with the capabilities needed and that they've asked for to change the situation on the ground. What's less well known is whether the administration is even fully committed to fulfilling the objectives of its own already limited policies. For all the talk we've heard about the President, his steadfast support for Ukraine, and the $116 million in security assistance the United States has promised to deliver, we know almost nothing about how these policies are actually being implemented. This administration has been a black box when it comes to even getting the most basic information about our efforts to aid Ukraine. Despite multiple requests, including a letter to the President from Senator Cardin and myself, we can't seem to get answers on fundamental questions. What equipment has been delivered to Ukraine? How long will it take to deliver the equipment we promised but not delivered? What's the process for determining what capabilities to provide? How does the equipment we've agreed to provide support the capabilities they've requested? How does our assistance efforts fit into a comprehensive strategy? This lack of transparency on the day-to-day implementation of U.S. assistance programs raises questions about the underlying policy guidance that drives it, whether the administration has actually had far more modest goals than the President's public rhetoric would suggest. For example, a bipartisan assessment conducted by retired General Wesley Clark and former top Pentagon official Dr. Philip Carver appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and other major newspapers, revealed that the Obama administration had issued extremely restrictive instructions on the type of non-lethal aid the United States could provide. The lack of this aid has created real problems for the Ukrainians. The fact is that no one knows in Congress how these regulations are being applied. This is a huge problem and stands in the way of a coherent and effective policy. Yesterday, the President's National Security Advisor testified that the Ukrainian forces is something we should be looking at. Well, strengthening the Iranian forces is something we definitely should be looking at. This is a welcome change of tone. Should be well beyond the point of looking at, in my view, because every day we delay, every day we dither, every day we match Russian action with half measures and self-imposed limitations, Moscow is emboldened and the danger grows. I am convinced that a piecemeal reactionary response to intimidation from Moscow is a recipe for failure. Instead, we must have a comprehensive, proactive strategy that strengthens NATO, deters Russian aggression, and gives Ukraine the political, economic, and military support it needs to maintain its independence. We need a strategy that seeks to shape outcomes, not be shaped by them. Much of that leadership must come from the White House. But this body also has a role to play. We should include funding for Ukrainian military systems in the upcoming spending bills. We should pass the Ukraine Freedom Support Act, which would authorize the assistance Ukraine needs today. We should pass legislation that will reduce Ukraine's and all of Russia's assistance and their reliance on Russia for its energy resources. And we should pass legislation to ensure that the United States never recognizes Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. The need for action could not be more clear. Through his aggression in Ukraine, President Putin and Moscow are sending a message to Ukraine and to the world that America and the West are indecisive and weak, and that their guarantees of support are meaningless. The Ukrainian people have rejected that message, choosing instead the path of democracy and openness, a path the United States has urged the Ukrainians but also the world to follow. We and our NATO allies must now stand with them. When America is strong, we stand unequivocally for freedom and justice. We don't back down in the face of threats and intimidation. And when we see a world that is more stable, less dangerous, and more free, that is because we do stand with our allies. More wars, more conflicts, more threats to our security, these do not arise from American strength. These arise from American weakness. Let us be strong again. Let us lead again. Let us help Ukraine. The world is watching.